Hello?
Hi, this is Pat White.
Hi, I don't know why I can't see you all.
I have had, hold on, let me allow my video. I had to go and join you by web
Oh,
because it was not, I couldn't get through to you.
I see you. Do you see me?
Not yet. Let's see, participants, let me.
Because I have this video camera.
Let's,
Wow. Okay, you got it. All right. Okay. See you later. Bye-bye.
What do you,
hey, I see Cheryl.
I see Patricia and I see, you're the only one I see. I saw for a moment, I guess, Cheryl. This is Hedy. And now I see Cheryl.
Yes, I'm here.
Aha. Camera keeps going on and off.
There you are, Hedy. Hi.
Yes.
Are you in presentation mode, Hedy?
Okay.
I tried mac and cheese.
I'm going to rely on you because I'm just seeing one person at a time. So.
To be seen. Wait. Oh, everybody else is their videos are stopped. There's a line through most of their videos.
So who's
Cindy
on the
Barr.
line now?
This is Pat.
Hi, Pat. So it's not just my problem, it's everyone.
No. You need to, and you can't, most of them have muted their audio too. You have a way of unmuting everyone if you're whoever's leading this call and allowing all videos. I don't know.
June is trying to get on, but she got
There's
somehow
Linda.
bumped off,
Yeah.
and I don't know. She's having trouble of some kind, and I don't know. Is Tracy? Tracy, are you running the meeting?
I don't see a Tracy on here.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh,
Yes,
good.
okay. Yeah, I thought you probably were. It was the Zoom invitation was yours. Okay, anyway, June's hoping to get in somehow, but she was on and then got somehow disconnected. So
Me
just wanted
too.
to let you know.
That happened to me too. Here we go. One at a time.
Me too.
Huh.
It's not the same as walking into a room and saying hello to everyone, is it?
Never is these days.
But I'm thankful for the technology myself.
Hi. Sorry to be late, but the link went to junk mail.
Oh.
How many are expected?
It says the host disabled attendee screen sharing. It's the message I just got.
Is Paige on? No.
I'm here.
I see her.
Paige, how many are registered?
Currently, we have 60 registrations, and I keep getting last-minute registrations, so I'm refreshing the page. So
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Screen share should be working now.
May I ask a question? When does the Zoom link normally go out to all the registrants?
Today,
It goes out today. That needs to be done a little bit earlier. I didn't have the link last night at all.
I
And
thought
I
it used to
registered
go out,
like 3 weeks ago, so.
I thought it used to go out Tuesday afternoon.
Same thing happened to me, Kathy. I registered a long time ago and never got the link, so I re-registered 5 minutes ago.
Oh,
That may be part of the problem today.
I did too, Lois. I re-registered when I hadn't gotten the link yesterday, so.
I
and
didn't receive
I
a
had
link
trouble
for this
making one of the
morning.
links work for some reason. I copied it and it didn't work. And then June had sent me another one. It looked the same to me, but anyhow, hers worked.
Well, I just got a message from June and she says she just can't get connected and she wants to start the meeting and asked if I would start the meeting. So I guess I will. And Tracy, thank you very much for hosting us once again, and welcome everyone to the League of Women Voters of Williamson County's 4th meeting, I believe. And we want to thank the Nashville chapter for everything that they continuously do to support our efforts and give us the experience that we certainly do not have yet. So welcome to everyone. I am unclear about the meeting in December, so I'm not going to make an announcement, and we'll just say that if June gets on and if anyone else knows the date for sure of the December meeting, Betty, maybe you have that. If you do,
I
would
do.
you chime in? Okay.
It's going to be Randall Petula, and it's on World Hunger, and it's just looking on my calendar. December, the 3rd week in December is, let me see. Calendar's not coming up very fast. Okay, it looks like it's the 16th.
I'll drop the link to that on the calendar registration in the chat.
Thank you.
Is that right? I mean, I'm not sure what I'm hearing here.
Would that be the 3rd?
Yeah, that's
It's the
December
3rd
16th.
Wednesday, which is the 16th of December.
Very good. Thank you, both Betty and Paige. I appreciate that clarification. And as far as I know, we are just privileged to have Miss Hedy Weinberg with us this afternoon.
Somebody
I'm not-
needs to mute.
Go to your room and calm down.
I guess we need to have everybody muted.
Except for Hedy.
Except for Hedy. And Hedy, well, I have asked Kathy Hoot is going to introduce you today to give the group some information about you. And Kathy, are you ready to unmute yourself and introduce Ms. Weinberg?
I think I'm unmuted. Can everybody hear me?
Very good. Thank you.
Good. Well, Hedy, I'm a true believer in the organization that you run. I have a monthly donation to you guys. Hedy Weinberg is the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Tennessee. She's quoted in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, and Washington Post, and she appears on CNN, MSNBC, and the BBC network. Ms. Weinberg is a nationally and internationally recognized advocate for her work. Included are awards for her work to defeat the Nashville English-only ballot initiative and to promote both reproductive rights and open government. Among her numerous awards are the Tennessee Library Association's Freedom of Information Award, the Academy for Women of Achievement by the YWCA of Nashville and Middle Tennessee, and the Bridge Builders Award from the American Muslim Advisory Council. Ms. Weinberg will discuss the Tennessee ACLU's mission to protect and promote the guarantees of the Bill of Rights and the Tennessee Constitution. Advocacy, coalition building, legislative lobbying, public education, policy research, and litigation represent the range of strategies that are used by the ACLU Tennessee. Ms. Weinberg, we're very glad to have you. Thank you for being with us.
Sure, and thank you so much. And good to see you all via Zoom. Some of you know, many of you, I don't know, and I'm delighted though to be here. The League of Women Voters has long been a partner of the ACLU of Tennessee, and we have been sitting at tables for quite some time talking about access to the ballot box, especially around voter restoration, worked very closely at the legislature, and have recently represented the League of Women Voters, the Tennessee statewide organization, in 2 lawsuits. And so I view you all as allies and friends. So it's good to see and meet more members. I thought I'd talk a little bit about who we are, how we do our work, and then maybe spend some time talking about what we've done the last 9 months while we've all been working remotely and dealing with, the COVID pandemic and just the tumultuous times we live in because of the clear issues around systemic racism, and certainly what has happened not only during the election and the campaigns, but post-election, and what that looks like for all of us as we move forward. From those of you, and Kathy, I appreciate hearing and thank you for being a longtime supporter. For those of you who don't know or aren't that familiar with the organization, the ACLU of Tennessee is an affiliate of the national organization, the National ACLU, which is housed in New York and in Washington, D.C. We're 53 affiliates strong. California has 3 affiliates. The ACLU of Tennessee represents the entire state. And our sole mission is to translate the promises, the guarantees of the Bill of Rights into reality for Tennesseans. We do that. We're a private, nonprofit, nonpartisan, like you, organization who has members. And we do our work in a number of ways. We speak about it as we talk about using what we call an integrative advocacy model, which means identifying strategies. What are the best strategies to proactively pursue an issue, either to challenge attacks on our civil liberties and civil rights, or to actually advance civil liberties and civil rights in a state like Tennessee. And so and Kathy spoke to it for a moment, the strategies we use include awareness, advocacy, public education, coalition building, policy research, legislative work, both at the local levels and at the state capitol. And what I think we're best known for is our litigation work. Though in all honesty, that's the last result. Our goal to really make a difference in terms of changing the landscape in this state is the recognition that we need to change hearts and minds, and certainly engage more people so that they can and do vote, which means not only civic engagement, engaging people, but also removing so many of the voter suppression tactics that we are quite familiar with in this state, and I know the League works on as well in terms of ensuring that one's voice can be heard through their vote. So in terms of the history of the ACLU of Tennessee.
Just a minute. Your voice is going in and out. Can you, I don't know if you need to be closer to your mic or what, but it's erratic.
Really? Huh. Well, I can go see if I can find a mic, or I can see if I can connect something. Would that be better? Hold on 1 second. Okay, I'm not sure I don't have a mic here. I'm coming back in a second.
While Hedy's getting that information or getting her microphone, I thought I'd also mention that the League of Women Voters in Nashville also has monthly programs, and if you get on our website, you'll see who's posted. Again, they're by Zoom, and they're the first Friday of each month. So just an extra place that you can go to find out more information about different topics. So our topic for December on December 4th, will be Professor Jim Blumstein from Vanderbilt University, who will be talking about the Electoral College and election law on a national scope. So you are welcome to go to our website and register and get the link for the Zoom meeting. Okay, so Hedy, I was just filling in while you were getting set up.
No worries. And does this sound better? Oh, excellent. I've never used it before, so I'm glad I have it. And I'm typically Luddite-like, so I apologize. But good to know about the problem with the computer. So just to return to ACLU's history, which I'm incredibly proud of, probably many of you know about the Scopes case, 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee, where Clarence Darrow, criminal defense lawyer, civil rights lawyer, represented John Scopes. And he did that as a volunteer ACLU of Tennessee lawyer. So our history begins in 1925, before the ACLU of Tennessee had actually been birthed in this state. The word was out of New York that Tennessee legislature had passed a law prohibiting the teaching of evolution. And the ACLU of Tennessee put ads in papers across the state looking for a teacher who was willing to teach evolution in order to get, and would then get arrested in order for the ACLU to represent that teacher and challenge the constitutionality of the law. That was 1925. In the in 1968, and there were other cases periodically in the state, but the next case that speaks to, I think, who we are in terms of continuing to advance freedom of speech and the right to protest and speak out is in 1968, when the ACLU asked Attorney Lucius Birch in Memphis to serve as an ACLU of Tennessee cooperating attorney and represent Dr. Martin Luther King. As you know, the history, he had come to Memphis to participate in a sanitation strike. And that first protest was very difficult and turned violent. And he wanted to return and have another march. And the city refused to give him a permit, saying it was too dangerous. And Dr. King wanted to march anyway. And there was real concern what would happen if he did go forward with his march. So ACLU worked with Dr. King and his colleagues and persuaded him to let us go to court to ask the court to ensure that Dr. King could in fact have a permit, that the permit should not have been denied. The court did in fact issue the permit, but within the next day, Dr. King was killed and was not given the opportunity to march. But that case speaks to the importance of freedom of speech, the right to petition our government, the right not to be shut down in terms of petitioning our government. And certainly the story goes on about the need for pursuing racial justice and recognizing that marginalized and disenfranchised voices need to always be heard. And so interestingly, we can jump to 2020 when the legislature convened or adjourned in March because the pandemic and the COVID-19 moment that everyone recognized we had a shutdown in the state. The legislature adjourned. They came back together a month or two later in a special session, and then they came back in June in another special session where the one thing they did was to pass a law chilling freedom of speech, right to protest, by saying that anyone who was quote unquote camping on state grounds could in fact be charged with a felony for camping. And you know, when you think about what camping is, they weren't even talking about putting up tents. They were talking about having a chair or two on the legislative plaza, having bottles of water sitting there by their chair, and individuals could be arrested. And were they convicted of a felony, as many of you know, they would lose their voting rights. They would have a criminal record that would prohibit them or keep them from probably getting employment, housing, any number of things. And the unfortunate thing, or what we need to be most aware of, is that this law was passed to keep a certain community of people from protesting the government. Okay. So I say that because, you know, history is interesting to follow, their cycles. And one of the things we say at the ACLU is the fight never stays won. So even though we succeed, we remain vigilant, and we have to remain vigilant even, well, regardless, in all honesty, whomever is in the White House. I will tell you, you know, just anecdotally, when President Obama was elected and he brought together in the White House a number of leaders of national public interest, civil rights, civil liberties groups. It was probably about 6 months after he was in office, and he was talking to the group about, you know, what he hoped would happen during his administration. And he looked our national ED in the eyes and he said, I wish some people would, you know, be silent about their criticism. I'm paraphrasing, at which point our national ACLU director said, I wouldn't be doing my job if I was. And I say this only because hopefully we're moving into we're moving into a new time with a new administration who is going to hopefully remove the darkness that we've been living under for the last 4 years. But ACLU remains vigilant because there are always fights that we need to participate in, and civil liberties and civil rights that we need to advance, especially in our state, where our state legislature, and regardless of our nonpartisan status, the fact that our legislature is supermajority Republican and has very little respect for either marginalized communities, communities of color, limited income communities. We have to recognize that the fight has to be robust, and that in coalition, and that's what I want to point out, in coalition, we have to work together to make sure that we are proud of our state and can change the landscape so that all people are treated fairly. And I say fairly because I think, to go back to what our mission is, it's about ensuring that all people are treated fairly and have the right to freedom of speech and religious freedom and due process and privacy. And so what that means for us is that when we select the priorities we focus on, which I will share with you in a moment, when we select those priorities, we also recognize the intersectionality of the issues, so that when we work on criminal justice reform, we're very cognizant of the need to think about systemic racism and how that affects policing, and then how policing impacts who is, you know, where police law enforcement are based and in what communities they find themselves, and how they treat the individuals they police affects who is being arrested, and then who is convicted, obviously sent to prison, and then what happens when people return from prison back into the community. So in some ways, it's a domino effect when you think about how someone enters a criminal justice system and then how their life is affected. But at the same time, it's also recognizing that if we can change one thing, we need to look at all the issues and how they're woven together to recognize where we have to start to do our work. So criminal justice reform is one of our main priorities in this state, probably really across the country. And the long-term goal, the vision, is to reduce the prison population by 50%. And when we say that, we're talking about recognizing who's in prison and how people got to prison, and that it's been decades since we have started to see our prisons fill up. And for many years, and until recently, the last probably 5-6 years, there was really no concern about who was being sent to prison, even though we knew disproportionate number of Black men were finding themselves in prison and part of the criminal justice system. And one has to ask, how did that happen? And how did we see a change? Not a change, how did we find so many Black men, especially going through this pipeline? And it's because of the kinds of laws that were being passed during the Nixon era many, many years ago, recognizing that there was a very clear intention as to how what laws should be passed in order to target communities of color. And I say that because we're still, even though it's a little bit more subtle, we're still dealing with some of those issues when we look at the kinds of laws that are passed in our state. I'm not going to talk about in Congress, but in our state. And when I reference the law about the recent law passed around criminalizing and chilling the right to protest, I mention that because the folks who were on the legislative plaza were young, and they were predominantly people of color. And so again, when we had law enforcement standing outside Legislative Plaza, watching what was going on, choosing to arrest night after night folks who were there just to protest, peacefully protest, both the Nathan Bedford Forrest bus that was up in the Capitol, but also asking to speak with Governor Lee. Night after night, they stood there peacefully, and yet they were being arrested. And then we see at another time, and most recently after the election results were announced, people, white men and women outside of Legislative Plaza with no police presence. And I mention that just to recognize very clearly that we cannot stand behind a cloak and pretend that that's not what's happening in our state. So racial justice, the lens of racial justice is how we're looking through, or how we're doing most of our work. We're using that lens as we try to understand what's happening around issues around criminal justice, around certainly access to the ballot box, which is our second priority. And that's where we do a lot of work with the League of Women Voters. Voter restoration, which is clearly one form of voter suppression, is an issue that the League, I know, and ACLU have been involved in for quite some time. And in a state like Tennessee, one out of 5 Black individuals have had their voting rights taken away because of a criminal felony conviction. So that just returns us back to the earlier conversation about criminal justice reform. But in Tennessee and many other states, though Tennessee and about 3 or 4 other states have very, very, I'll call them egregious, but laws that make it relatively impossible for individuals with felony convictions to get their voting rights back. So in Tennessee, like other states, except for 2 states in New England, your right to vote is taken away when you have a felony conviction, okay? And in Tennessee, there are certain crimes, if you've been convicted of felonies, you can never get your voting rights back. But in Tennessee, the way people typically can get their rights back are if they complete their prison sentence, okay? One would say fair enough. If they complete parole and probation, that's part of punishment, so one might even say that's okay. If they pay back their fines and fees. Now, fines and fees are exorbitant, especially when you recognize that someone has been in prison for quite some time. And so their ability to have the finances, the resources to pay back their fines and fees, very limited. So most people are not even able to choose to apply for a voter restoration certificate because they don't have the finances to pay back their fines and fees and be eligible. But the most egregious provision in the law, and we're the only state in the country to have this provision, is that individuals who are not current in child support cannot get their voting rights restored if they have a felony conviction. So one has to ask, why was that? I mean, what does being current in child support have to do with your voting rights or with, frankly, your conviction? And it's just an additional form of punishment. It's frankly, a very blatant voter suppression tactic when you understand who you're actually targeting. And it's one way to keep certain people from accessing the ballot box. And so the League has been very involved in this conversation, NAACP, various sororities, ACLU, Equity Alliance, just a number of organizations have come together in this state to work together in an attempt to persuade our legislature to change the law. ACLU about 12 years ago actually filed a lawsuit to try to strike down the law, since we thought it would be very difficult to change the law at the legislature. We were not successful with that lawsuit. We went all the way up to the Sixth Circuit, which is a court of appeals that covers Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, and I am blocking Kentucky, Ohio, Tennessee, and Michigan. And we were not successful in pursuing, or not successful with the court. So now we've returned to the legislature with the hope that more legislators are aware of the importance of allowing people to vote. But it is a steep uphill battle. And for those of you, well, all of you who live in Williamson County, I would say that your Williamson County delegation is not supportive of voter restoration. So any conversations you can have with them would be very, very important. One of the things, as you know, is that our legislature is not as open-minded as they should be about protecting and advancing civil liberties and civil rights. And Williamson County should really be in a place where they can have elected officials who recognize the importance of allowing their constituents to have a voice. And that voice, as you know, is through their vote, often through their vote. So criminal justice reform and access to the ballot box, you can see how closely they're intertwined. I'm going to step back, and I'm sorry, when I went to get my microphone, I kind of went off my talking points, but I do want to return to criminal justice reform for a moment to talk to you about fines and fees in general. We just talked about voter restoration and the fact that you have to pay back your fines and fees in order to participate in democracy, being able to, cast your ballot. There are other fines and fees that we all need to be aware of when we think about how to be inclusive of our neighbors, our friends, people we don't know, but who reside in our county and should be treated fairly. And so when you think about the criminal justice system and you think about people being arrested, sometimes just for misdemeanors, we all see Law and Order or various police TV shows, and they always talk about innocent until proven guilty. And while that might challenge some of you on some level, the reality is, unless you are, and the state can prove you're a safety risk, a danger, or might flee when you're arrested, you should have the right to remain at home while you're pending your trial. Because having a trial can take years to have for a whole host of reasons, not just the defendant and their lawyer, but often the state asks for continuations. So at the end of the day, when someone is arrested and they are placed in jail awaiting trial, they often have the option, unless, as I said, they're a flight risk or a safety risk, they often have the option to bail out, right? You see that all the time, people bail out. Well, to bail out, it means you need financial resources. And the reality is, unless you have those financial resources, and that might be all of us on this call, but for most people, they don't have the $5,000 cash, or 10% of that would be $500 that they would then have to actually give to a bonds person. And the bonds people would keep that $500, but allow, bring it to the sheriff or the court, and that would allow the individual to bond out. ACLU and others are working really hard. And when I say others, often not likely partners, we work with the American Friends for Prosperity, the Koch brothers, and with the Beacon Center, which is a libertarian group. We don't agree on many things, but we work with those two groups around money bail reform, trying to change the laws so that individuals are not required to stay in jail pending trial solely because they don't have the financial resources. And the research shows that typically an individual being able to return home without putting up any amount of money is still going to return to court for their hearing. But if you keep someone locked up in jail while they're awaiting trial, the collateral consequences are huge, because what that means is the individual has been taken away from their family. So you're starting to already disrupt the family situation. If they have a job, they clearly lose their job if they're not showing up. If they're in school, they clearly are not going to be attending classes, therefore, disrupting hopefully plans they had for their future. As important is they're not going to be able to work and support their attorney, who is hopefully working with them to identify what actually happened and whether or not there are witnesses or others who can provide support for their defense. And so when you end up keeping someone locked up in jail, who then appears in court in their orange jumpsuit, which then typically challenges the jury to look at them in a way that might make them seem like a law-abiding citizen because they're in chains and an orange jumpsuit, it again really challenges fairness and due process. And so that money and financial resources are the one thing keeping an individual from their freedom pending trial is something that we believe, as do organizations we work with, needs to be changed, and that we need to change a law for that. Recognize, however, the bail bond industry is huge, right? And so they're really fighting any change in the law because from their perspective, they're one, as they like to say, providing a service to people who otherwise would be stuck in jail. Because if an individual puts up bond, that individual has to pay the full amount, so $5,000. Often just for a misdemeanor, that's the average amount of bond in Nashville. So one, they say they're doing a service for the individual arrested. They also like to create this illusion that they're ensuring public safety, that they're protecting the public. And that's just not correct. Unfortunately, there are, cases sometimes out there that give you pause and you go, why was that person ever out? And I know I felt that way too sometimes when I've heard, and they're not frequent stories, but at the end of the day, most people arrested, especially those arrested for misdemeanors, should not be required to stay in jail because they don't have the financial resources to either put up the full $5,000 or to find a bail bonds person who they can pay $500 if it's a $5,000 bond. And I will tell you, we're involved in one lawsuit now representing the Nashville Community Bail Fund, who actually has been able to create a pot of money to provide cash bail for individuals who are arrested. Interesting, if you or I or the Nashville Bail Fund say we have the $5,000, we don't want to lose $500 to the bail bonds industry, or we don't want to work with the bail bonds person, and we actually say we will give you $5,000 court in order to allow this individual to return home pending the trial. It turns out in many counties that I give you as a third party, I'm going to bail, Elizabeth out. At the end of the day, Elizabeth shows up, so everything's fine. But at the end of the day, the court says, you owe us fines and fees, Elizabeth. And so we're going to take that amount of money out of the bail. Again, very unfair. There's no correlation between bail and fines and fees. So we have a criminal justice system that has created all of these twists and turns and made it even more difficult, let alone the crisis and the trauma involved in an arrest and recognizing the trauma typically of people who are guilty of certain crimes. There is a real need to look at the criminal justice system and begin to recognize that there are some very serious areas that need to be addressed, and that the idea of locking people up and throwing away the key and starting that even prior to conviction is problematic, not just for the individuals who eventually will return to our communities. And so we want to make that not only the reentry, but the process of entering the criminal justice system and the time spent in the criminal justice system such that you are still treating people with the dignity and respect they need, because they will reenter our communities. I'm just kind of throwing a lot of this out here. I'm happy to take questions. I'm happy to talk to you about what we've been doing during these 9 months, remotely, which has involved really recognizing who are the most vulnerable communities in our state dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I can talk to you more about that. I can talk to you about our voting rights work, our religious freedom work, our access to reproductive health care services as it relates to abortion services. I'm really happy to, I'm looking at the time, it's 1:43, talk to you about almost anything you would like to hear about in terms of ACLU work. So I don't know, how do you, what would you like, Elizabeth? You're muted. You're muted.
Sorry. I was looking at the chat and there was something in there. Can somebody else tell me what it was? Because it's already disappeared off my screen. Kathy, do you know?
So one question is, what is expected to be in a criminal justice bill in 2021 before the legislature?
Good question. We're looking at issues. We're building our legislative agenda now and looking at issues around fines and fees and also policing, because policing and police accountability is very important. Having lived through, we've all lived through the last 7 months and what happened in May to George Floyd is a reminder that this can happen, or Breonna Taylor, these things can happen in Tennessee in a moment. And our goal is to ensure that we have a better idea about what's happening with policing in Tennessee. Recognize there are 95 counties, 95 sheriffs, many more police chiefs. They have strong lobbyists, but we're looking at ways to create, I don't want to say a more professional law enforcement forces, but recognize the importance for transparency as it relates to prosecutors, police and sheriff. So I can't tell you specifically what the bills would look like. Other issues around school to prison pipeline, because school to prison pipeline refers to, children as young as kindergartners entering school, and yet because of behavior issues, acting out in kindergarten when they luckily, hopefully can return to the classroom, but acting out, being sent to the back of the classroom, being sent to the hallway by the time they're in 4th, 5th grade, to the principal's office in 7th grade, suspended in high school, 9th grade, expelled. And I know this sounds extreme, but these scenarios play out every day in schools in Tennessee. And so that when a 17-year-old or 15-year-old ends up in juvenile detention, there's a good likelihood that they will end up in the prison system. And so looking at how to disrupt that school to prison pipeline. And a lot of that has to do with education equity issues. So again, intersectionality between access to education and criminal justice reform. We're still at the point where we're thinking about the bills and drafting legislation and finding sponsors. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm seeing these. Okay, what is it?
The term defund the police.
Defund. Yeah. So defund the police. It's not my favorite term. I don't want to blame any political party for using it, or any part of a political party, group within a political party. My feeling is that the important area we focus on right now is investing. I'm not even going to say reinvesting, but investing in communities that are typically over-policed and underserved. And I think as we do that and recognize that when you allow a community to really see that they're respected because their schools don't have broken windows and their kids are using books that aren't 5-10 years old, and that they have access to art classes, and that public libraries are open and have
activities for kids, when you start and that there's access to health care, when you start providing those services for underutilized, under-resourced center communities, I think you will begin to see perhaps lower criminal activity, as they say, but more importantly, less of a need for the focus of policing in communities. So I think then divesting, which is more the term I think appropriate than defunding, then divesting.
Hi, Alyssa. This is.
I'm sorry. So I think divesting is a term which I would focus on rather than defunding. If you look at the time, what police spend their time on, often it's things that have nothing to do with criminal activity, right? And so that's where I think we're not talking about, or from my perspective, we're not talking about, just getting rid of law enforcement, but we're recognizing that a lot of the funds that go to law enforcement should really go to different programs, to different communities, to teachers, to nurses, to resources that ensure that under-resourced communities, and it's typically, certainly in the cities, communities of color, that there are resources provided as opposed to putting them just in police departments. We've been doing some work in Memphis on police surveillance and who is being surveilled and what kind of equipment the police are getting. And in fact, as you might already know, in a number of police departments across the country, and certainly some in Tennessee, there's a federal government program that actually provides, if you apply for it, military equipment for police departments to have. I mean, there's no reason to have these tanks that are used during wartime or when you have National Guard issues. You don't need local police departments to have all this military equipment. And I use that as an example because it's just a reminder that law enforcement has much more than they need. I mean, we could talk a lot about how law enforcement gets some of its resources by a practice called civil asset forfeiture, where law enforcement has the right under law to basically seize your property, your car, your computer that's sitting in the back of your back seat, your diamond necklace you might be wearing, when they stop you and then ask to see your license and maybe even see that you have $5 $20 bills in your wallet. They can then make the assumption, write it out, that they believe that your resource or whatever you have, your property, was the result of some criminal activity, typically drug trafficking. And then they take your property, and the burden is on you to prove that that property was not part of some, criminal activity. And I say that as an example because, again, there is just a lot of I'm sorry, I don't know if someone was talking to me. There's not a lot, there need to be better restrictions and better recognition of what resources police really need. And if they need more resources, which is questionable, though they should be paid, officers should be paid, I think, a better wage, but they don't need to take those resources, get those resources by basically stealing property from individuals and then selling the property and putting it into the coffers of the police departments. What type of education programs do you have to help? So we do a lot of know your rights trainings and empowerment trainings and talking with young people. We did a series at the HBCUs in Nashville about know your rights when you're stopped by police, working on doing know your rights programming for parents around how to work with school boards. I would hope that you all, I know this is something that the Tennessee League of Women Voters work on, but focusing on your local election commissions, not necessarily that they need to know what their rights are, but that you're there to ensure that they are doing what they should be doing. So those kinds of trainings would be great. We aren't necessarily doing those. But our focus has been on young people, high school students, and communities of color in terms of knowing one's rights as it relates to police, as it relates to speech, as it relates to right to protest. I'm looking at other questions. I'm sorry, I can't seem to move my, if there's, that's me too. I'm sorry, this computer keeps giving me other messages. So other questions? It's 1:53.
I believe that there was one from Debbie Gould. She says the issue of freedom of speech in an era of disinformation is challenging. Can you talk about ACLU's approach to balancing your response?
Yeah, that's really such an important issue right now, because what we're seeing happen during these last 2 weeks, especially with the election. And I think we're going to all struggle through that and figure it out. I mean, the CEOs now, the social media venue is really giving a lot of airtime to misinformation. And I think there will have to be a conversation about what happens. We're just beginning, like you, I'm sure, to think about how do you support speech, but at the same time, ensure some reliability. And I think that's very complicated, and something that, we're going to continue to have to talk about. There are and have been, some restrictions on freedom of speech, but it gets very difficult to shut down speech without deciding who should be making, who makes that decision. And is it, I'm shutting down your speech because I don't like it or because it's false? And, we have libel laws, we have slander laws, which in part speak to when you have the right to speech and when you don't. So I don't have an answer except to say this is a conversation I've just started with staff to think about, look at what the laws are, think about how you ensure that balance. There's always been, and Deborah Fisher could talk about this more, but for ACLU, it's always been an issue around access to information versus privacy. It's a little bit off exactly free speech, but that it's the same thing as how do you ensure the right to privacy, which we all have and should want to hold near and dear, with the right to access to information when the government has that, I mean, I remember years ago having a bill out there. I don't think I've told Deborah about this, where there was an effort to shut down residential addresses of police officers. And from our perspective, that was legitimate. Now that was a long time ago. I don't know that I've changed my opinion on that. The right to privacy versus access to information. How important is that information? Well, as one legislator said to me, who was very angry that ACLU would take that position that supported the FOP, he said to me, there are times when you can find an individual cop in a home that clearly they could not afford. So that gives you some idea that maybe they're engaged in behavior that's not appropriate. Is that what should be the deciding factor as to whether or not, one's residential space and location is available to everyone who might have anger directed at that individual where their family members are threatened? So the whole idea about what is free speech and what restrictions should there be, we're dealing with this, as you might imagine, a lot around what happened in Charlottesville, and issues around hate speech and who should be able, how far do you go to protect speech? When are there limits? And these are conversations I think we're all going to have and think about what those limits are and what the danger is of putting in place limits. But I do think we have to have a serious conversation about misinformation and how that needs to be shut down and who's responsible for shutting it down, but what can be lost It's a very fine line. I think someone asked about access to abortion. Was that a conversation, a question people had? I saw. So, you know, just frankly, we currently have 4 active lawsuits around ensuring that women have access to abortion. And one focused on Mount Juliet, Tennessee, in Wilson County, where Carafama Clinic came to town and opened up a clinic in Mount Juliet. And when they opened up the clinic, I mean, within days, the local city of Mount Juliet Council passed a zoning law prohibiting abortion services to be made available in any building, any location in Tennessee, in Mount Juliet. The way they wrote it, it was very clear that they were shutting down and just targeting abortion services, because where this particular clinic was in a building with other doctor services and surgical procedures. So we went to court and filed a lawsuit, and it just recently ended during the pandemic. But during the pandemic, we have filed 3 separate lawsuits focusing on access to abortion when Governor Lee put in place an emergency order and said only essential services can and should be available during this time. It was right in the, you know, I think March 20th. He didn't say it outright, but basically they interpreted that, the government, state government interpreted that as to mean that abortion services were not essential and could be shut down. So ACLU went to court with our partners, Planned Parenthood, and filed a lawsuit challenging the executive order that the governor had signed. And we were successful in that lawsuit in court to ensure that women could still access abortion services during the pandemic when there was an emergency order in place. And then subsequently, after the legislature adjourned, or not adjourned, but recessed, and then came back, and I can't remember if it was April, May, or June. I can't remember the exact date, but the one thing they did at 12:30 at night, having promised, the Senate side had promised that they were not going to vote on an abortion ban bill, but they changed their mind and they voted on an abortion ban bill that was, as the governor says, the most restrictive in the country. And it basically prohibited abortions from the moment of conception, which in and of itself makes no sense. But, and then they have staggered provisions within the law that says, well, you know, we're prohibiting abortions at 6 weeks. And then they literally say, if that's ruled unconstitutional, well, we're going to make it 12 weeks. And if it's not, if 12 weeks is unconstitutional, given lawsuits, we'll make it 14 and then 20. I've never seen a law written like that, but ACLU went to court with Planned Parenthood, and the judge, and this was a Trump appointee, the judge ruled in federal court that issued a temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction to ensure that the law will be on hold until a trial takes place, which probably won't happen for a year. And then we went back to court. Then we filed another lawsuit a month or 2 ago, focusing on we call it a medical reversal abortion law that the legislature passed to say, you're all familiar with, you know, there's a surgical procedure and then there's a medical where you take the medicine in order to have the abortion. And the legislature passed a law ordering doctors to tell their patients who are going to have an abortion using the medicine that they could in fact stop the procedure if they didn't take the second pill. And that's not based on any scientific evidence, or it's talk about misinformation. It's misinformation. And all the experts and all the studies show that it's not reliable. It really creates distrust for the doctors feel really creates distrust with their patients when they're mandated to give information that they don't believe is real. And so we went to court again a couple months ago, and recently the federal district court ruled that yes, we have a temporary order in place to prohibit the enforcement of the law until the trial or a hearing takes place. And the state is appealing that. The state has appealed both injunctions in the abortion ban and the medical reversal abortion requirement. So they're not giving up, and they're taking it, to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeal to challenge the temporary restraining orders in place now. So this is between access to abortion and targeting and attacking transgender student athletes in public schools. Our legislature has for a moment paused on their attacks on immigrants and refugees and have targeted women and transgendered individuals. And it's very disturbing and very difficult to see sometimes the hate that comes from our legislature. But the important thing is to, stand tall and be vigilant and speak respectfully to these legislators and find their constituents who are willing to talk with them, be it clergy or local business people or donors, so that legislators start to recognize that they need to be representing all their constituents and not just, the small community of people that they think want to keep in place a very restrictive, narrow approach toward humanity.
Ms. Weinberg, we thank you very, very much for coming. We could probably take one more question. If there's someone who would like to speak, please unmute yourself and let it be known that you have a question. We'll give a second to have a response if there's someone who has a question before we close the meeting. Anybody? Well, I think if there isn't one, in my instance, I don't know where to begin with the number of questions that I would like to ask. So I have the feeling there are others that might feel exactly that way. I hope that we'll have the opportunity to hear from you again. I know your schedule is very busy, but this was a very helpful meeting and we appreciate your presentation very much. I, for one, have lots to learn, and we would hope to have you again another time or another representative so that we can learn more about ways that we can all engage and help with the mission of ACLU. We thank you very much again for coming and visiting us. Thank you.
You're very welcome. And for those of you who want to learn more, go to our website, www.aclu-tn.org, because we have a lot of great information and resources, but just information about what we're up to. We worked with 150 volunteers in our Vote Like Your Rights Depends on It campaign, GOTV campaign. And are excited about, continuing our volunteer mobilization. We have an amazing staff. We're a staff of 11, and each staff member is just creative, compassionate, enthusiastic, and inspiring. So I get a lot of that good energy from them, and I know we'll continue our work with the League, and good to meet all of you.
And we thank you for all of your work as well. Thank you. Thanks again.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Take care.
much.
Have a good holiday, everyone. Bye-bye.
You as well.
Hey, Beck.